So very glad to introduce our guest speaker today for what is planned to be, as I said, our last virtual program before we switch back to monthly luncheons, as long as COVID conditions allow for that. So here's hoping, crossed fingers. But today we have as our guest Tim Connor, writer, photographer, and national award-winning journalist based right here in Spokane. And Tim, as I'm reading your bio, which I think I probably pulled from one or another website that you were featured on, let me know if I get anything wrong, or you can let me know at the end and then we'll correct the record. Okay. So what I have here is born at Camp Hanford, Washington in 1956.
All true.
All true. He was named the Outstanding Graduate in Journalism from Washington State University in 1979. Tim became an associate editor at Spokane magazine in 1981 and has also written for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the Portland Oregonian, Washington Law, and the Washington Law and Politics, and Seattle Weekly, my own journalistic alma mater from many years ago, among other publications as well. He's been awarded 3 Sigma Delta Chi first place national awards for investigative reporting and was honored in 2011 with the Excellence in Legal Journalism Award by the Washington State Bar Association. And prior to the book that he'll be talking about today, his newest one, Beautiful Wounds, his most recent book with Margaret Witt was Tell, Love, Defiance, and the Military Trial at the Tipping Point of Gay Rights. And I guess I should say the entire title of his new book, Beautiful Wounds, A Search for Solace and Light in Washington's Channeled Scablands. So without further ado, I'm pleased to present Tim Connor.
Thank you. That was a splendid introduction. And I wish the titles of my books were getting shorter. Makes it easier for everybody. So what I thought I would do today is, well, say hi and thank Neil for inviting me. When Neil and I scheduled this, my book wasn't out yet. So this is, oops, I'll just cock my light here. This is what it looks like. It's, if you're interested, it's on sale at Auntie's and also Wishing Tree Books, but you can actually order it. It's being nationally distributed, so it shouldn't be hard to find online if you're interested after today's presentation. So we kind of rolled out the book at the Hive, I think it was May 18th, while I was on Mount St. Helens. And one of my friends brought her mom, and her mom knew only of me in the book by reading a story in the Spokane Review about the book. And she said, she didn't know if she was in the mood to come hear a reading about depression and divorce, which is an indication of where the book started from. The reason it's called a sojourn is because it was something, this book kind of invited me into writing it by having a long experience of grief and heartache, and I took to the Scablands to be alone and process that. So that's where that comes from. But anyway, that process resulted in quite a bit of photography that the folks at Norton in New York fell in love with when we pitched the book to them a couple of years ago. Like everything else, it took a while with COVID to get everything done between here in New York and China, but finally, the book arrived on May 10th, and I'm happy to have it out there and to talk about it. So what I'm going to do today is walk through the story of the Great Floods, which is a lot of what the book is about. Eventually, in my slideshow, you'll get to meet, at least get to meet a picture of the great geologist J. Harlan Bretz, who came to Spokane a century ago with his graduate students from the University of Chicago to explore this part of the world. Bretz was convinced that something very unusual had happened in Washington State, and he and his grad students set out 100 years ago to figure it out, and they did. So when I reference Bretz, that's who I'm talking about. It's also key to the Bretz story that when he proposed his theory of the Great Floods in 1923, that he was ostracized by the geologic community in the United States. And he was not vindicated until he was in his 90s when he was finally given the Penrose Medal which is the highest award that an American geologist can win. And so I've tried to capture that story. Somebody's horn is going off here. I don't know if you can hear it. In the book, and in a way, the book is designed to walk in Brett's footsteps through the Scablands, and so that's how it's organized. So I'm gonna click on screen sharing here, and that'll cue up my slideshow. Let's see. Let's see if I can get this. Okay. Hold on. Here we go. Can you see that okay? Is that good? Is everybody getting that? The coyote and the, okay.
Looks
Yeah.
good.
Can you hear me okay as well?
Adela, you're not getting the slideshow?
Yes.
Oh, you
Oh,
are?
yeah, okay.
Oh, good.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Well, this is the cover page with the cover of the book. I'm glad that horn stopped. It was kind of driving me nuts outside. So this is my mom and her father, and the reason this picture's here is that they, in many ways, inspired me on this journey. I was my mom's caregiver during the last phase. She was dying when I was finishing this book. In fact, I finished the book about a couple of weeks after she passed. Just the nicest person, and she got a lot of that from her dad. That's my grandpa Gil, that she's dancing with. I was born at Camp Hanford, and one of the things that Hanford brought to Washington State, unfortunately, was Jim Crow. Because Hanford was constructed during the war, there was a manpower shortage in the Northwest. They needed thousands of construction workers. They wound up recruiting heavily in the South, and to accommodate their racism. African-American workers that came to Hanford were not allowed to live in Richland or Kennewick. They had to live in Pasco, West Pasco, which is where my family's from. I didn't put this in the book, but after the war, there was a big debate in Pasco over whether the new municipal swimming pool would be integrated. And the reason it was integrated is because of my grandfather, Gil Hartman. He insisted on it. He was a member of the civic board that was in charge of raising funds and building the new pool. And Gil is also the person that exposed me to this place. This is one of America's great water gaps. It's called Balula Gap. It's pretty much where the Columbia begins its U-turn toward the Pacific. And as it does that, the Columbia, like the Clearwater and other rivers that use this water gap before them, just barges through the Horse Heaven Hills. And so it creates this grand this grand amphitheater. And Gil liked to take me fishing up in the Blue Mountains, and we would go through Balula Gap to get there. And it was unlike any place I'd ever been before in terms of the scenery and just the sound, the way the sound of the train horns resonated off the water. So it left a lasting impression with me. Okay, now how do we get from Balula Gap to here? This is as far back as I'm going to go today in the geology lesson, but I think it's really important that people understand where we are. I mean, Spokane is actually in a very interesting position relative to the development of the planet. Because that red dot in the middle with the arrow that says Belt Basin connected to it is pretty much where Spokane was, not just 750 million years ago, but as recently as 250 million years ago, Spokane was a coastal city, believe it or not. Everything that's if you're looking at a map, pretty much everything to the left of Spokane and Washington State has come in off the Pacific. That's the underlying bedrock, except for the basalt flows, which I'll get to in a minute. I had the joy last week of going on a field trip with a senior USGS geologist who's helping to put together this puzzle. We are now understanding that there are Spokane rocks in Australia and Antarctica. And there are also Australian rocks and East Antarctica rocks in Spokane. And the reason this is true is because actually it says Rodinia. This is the supercontinent before Pangaea, but actually you go back several hundred more years to the pre-existing supercontinent Columbia, where the belt basin formed. It was a sedimentary basin that formed, well over a billion and a half years ago. And that's how our rocks got intermingled. And one of the reasons I bring that up is because the Ice Age floods unloosed. Norman MacLean actually writes about that in his book, A River Runs Through It. The Great Floods brought tons and tons and tons of rocks from Montana and Idaho into Washington State. And a lot of them wound up in Spokane. And frankly, because I swim so often in the Spokane River, they're uncovered there and they're just brilliant. They just look like a jewel box. And I'll come back to that. But this is as far back as I wanted to go in the Earth story, but it's a remarkable Earth story. And anyway, I'll take you to the next slide. We'll move forward in time a bit. So this is a cross section. So instead of looking down, we're looking across. This is showing how the state of Washington was built. We are on, our pictures are obscuring the Washington-Idaho line, but Spokane is to the right, where the word loess is. That loess is just another word for polluted soil, and we're all familiar with what that is. CRBG below that is the Columbia River Basalt Group. And so Silesia and everything to the left of here these are terrains that are coming in off the Pacific, either with the Juan de Fuca plate, which is now the last of the plates subsiding under the North American plate. Before that was the Kula plate, but we get all these terrains, and they're all relatively new, a few hundred million years old at most. The older rock is over beneath Spokane. Our pictures are obscuring a slice of the old world that says NA, which is basically the foundation of the North American continent. This is probably the oldest rock people are likely to see in the Spokane area. It's called Hauser Lake Gneiss. This is a This is basically a part of the bottom of the belt basin that has gotten metamorphosed by the stresses of the Spokane Dome geologic sequence, which I don't have time to describe, but maybe that's for another lecture. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have used the word lecture. Another talk. This is another map of Washington that shows the Missoula flood deposits. So these are the deposits that came in from Montana and Idaho each time the ice dam on the Clark Fork River broke at the end of the Ice Age, and it covered the lighter color here just indicates that it's a covering over the underlying basalt. But obviously, just walking around Spokane, you'll see the basalt is there. I like this slide because the dark green on the right is what's left of Rodinia. So there actually is Rhodinian landscape, not just in eastern Washington, but actually, if you're driving out on East Trent Avenue, you eventually come to a huge outcrop of the Pritchard Formation, which is the bottom of the belt basin. I know where it is, and I love to go out there and collect rocks, although it is a little bit noisy and dangerous with all the truck traffic out there at times. So you want to bring a friend. You're going to do that. So I'm now moving forward to 15 million years ago, almost yesterday in geologic time. So this is the period which actually began 18 million years or so ago, when the basalt flows took place, and they all emanated from vents in eastern Oregon, northeastern Oregon, and southeastern Washington. I've highlighted this slide. By the way, the shadowy figure on the right is probably the best geology teacher in America. He teaches at Central Washington University. His name is Nick Zentner. A lot of people are already familiar with Nick because he's done an incredible amount of work on videos and some public TV, trying to explain basically the land beneath us in the Pacific Northwest. And just a great teacher. Well, what Nick is showing here is the Rosa basalt flow, which is about the middle of the period when the basalt flows were underway. The darker pattern that you see there are the pre-existing basalt flows that began like 17 million years ago. And those include the Grand Ronde basalt flow, which underlies Spokane. If you go to the bowl and pitcher on the Spokane River, the bowl and pitcher is made from Grand Ronde basalt. The higher level of that, as you go up out on the West Plain, is what they call Wanapum basalt, which is roughly the same age, a little bit older than the Rosa flow. The reason I'm showing the Rosa flow is because it just highlights the dynamic nature of this period. That crack that you see that goes, I don't know if you can read it, but that has Anatone, Winona, and Tokyo. Tokyo is that area that you pass on I-90. It's the last truck stop and way station before you get to Ritzville, if you know what I'm talking about. So when you're crossing, when you're at Tokyo on I-90, you're right there where the ancient vent was. And you have to imagine the scene from like the Big Island of Hawaii 3 years ago, when the eruptions on the Big Island were not coming from the volcano, but from these seams in the earth, these showers of molten rock shooting into the air. Well, that's what was going on at this vent. In fact, I've got my hand, this is the volcanic spatter. It's much lighter than basalt. It's actually, if I put it down, it will leave like crumbs, like cinnamon colored on my desk. But this is the stuff that got ejected into the air 15 million years ago as that basalt was coming out. And it flowed all the way, the Rosa system flowed all the way to the Columbia River. This is the pile where I gathered the samples I was just showing you. This is a huge pile, much bigger than a pickup truck, sitting above Rock Creek out in this remote part of Whitman County. And this is where it was headed. I don't know if some of you may recognize this. This is probably Washington's most famous basalt formation. It's called the Feathers, and it's located in Frenchman Coulee, which you come to on I-90 as you begin the descent. If you're going to Seattle on I-90, once you get past Moses Lake and the town of George, you'll notice the freeway starts to dip down towards the river. And part of what's on your right that you can't see is one of the enormous coulees of the Great Floods, called Frenchman Coulee. The Feathers, you can see why they're called the Feathers, is the remnant pillar or the remnant pillars of the basalt, of the Rosa basalt flow in Frenchman Coulee. And it's like a natural Stonehenge. I mean, it was just it's a crescent of these beautiful pillars, very popular with rock climbers, although not in February when I took this picture. And that is Rosa basalt. So that tells you how far the basalt flow, this molten lava, went across the landscape to get all the way from places like Tokyo near Ritzville to the Columbia River. This is a map a modern map that I lifted from the Washington Department of Natural Resources. I've added to it to show you where Glacial Lake Missoula is over on the right, right above the term Idaho. This is what I want to focus on for the moment. I've written it in as the Clark Fork Ice Dam. This is where during the last phases of the Wisconsin Ice Age, the Purcell Trench ice lobe glacier came down the Purcell Trench and blocked the Clark Fork River. That ice dam is what created Glacial Lake Missoula, which filled up the river valleys of western Montana to a remarkable degree. And then beginning about 17 million years ago, the ice dam started breaking periodically. So about every 100 years or so, the ice dam would shatter. Just too much pressure, it would blow itself apart, and this inland tsunami would run down the Purcell Trench, take a right turn at Coeur d'Alene, come right through Spokane, and then head off to the west to Grand Coulee and down towards Palouse Falls. I've written down Balula Gap here, which is where the floodwaters piled up behind Balula Gap because it was a constriction. Not all the water that was unloosed by the Missoula floods could get through Balula Gap. And I've also got Grand Coulee over here because that's obviously a landmark of the Scablands. But this is what Washington State looked like at the end of the last ice age. You notice that Spokane did not get covered in ice, but Seattle and Olympia did. The Puget Lobe went much further south than the Purcell, Columbia, and Okanagan lobes. So this is a photo of current day Lake Pend Oreille. And the reason it's in here is because of that white face in the middle of the photograph, that sheer cliff covered with snow. That is where the Purcell Trench Glacier got blocked by Green Monarch Ridge. That's Green Monarch Ridge. And this is right where the ice dam formed. And that's why that steep hillside looks like somebody finished it with a trowel. That trowel was a massive glacier from Canada that blocked the Clark Fork. And that leads us to J. Harlan Bretz and his hard hat. That's what he looked like. Oh, I don't know, when this photo was probably taken in the 50s, so it's well over a half century old. Bretz passed away in 1981, I believe. So one of the things, this is a Usgs Topological Map in 1910 that Bretz discovered when he was teaching high school. He was not even a credentialed geologist at this time, but he was a very avid student of geology. And he actually, the story is that he almost ran to the UW library the day this map came out so he could study it, because it had been written about it in geological circles. And what it shows is this tremendous bicameral depression south of Quincy, Washington, which is remarkable. I'll show you one of my photos of it here in a minute, but less than a minute actually. But what struck Bretz is nobody had an explanation for it, and he thought there should be. So this is what it looks like in person. And I know this looks like that it was taken from a drone or an airplane, but I'm literally standing on the back wall of a coulee taking this photo. And the remarkable thing about it, I'm just getting this upper part where you see the word in the potholes. That's just what you're looking out towards. That dense orange line to the right of that is where I'm standing at the high back wall of that. It's a bicameral chamber, and I'm standing and only able to photograph the north chamber. That's how large Potholes Coulee is. And Bretz thought that something was going on there that somebody needed to explain. And that really piqued his interest in exploring the Scablands and being able to explain trying to explain Potholes Coulee and other features. So there's a great Spokane story involving Bretz because, like I mentioned earlier, he came here. He was actually invited here by teachers at Lewis and Clark High School to come explore what turns out to be, at least what's emerging, is that the teachers at Lewis and Clark High School were actually speculating that a great flood had caused the Scablands, and Bretz had the credentials to do that investigation, which he did. He and his students did for 2 years. And this map is a remarkable example of the work that Bretz did, largely on foot. The teachers at LC eventually loaned him an automobile, but for the first year or so of his work, he and his students were walking and catching trains to get to various destinations to put together this incredible map. Obviously, this was in the time before photography from airplanes and satellites, so it's a remarkable achievement. I actually, when I did Beautiful Wounds, this is one of the things I insisted be in the entry to the book, so you'll find it both in the inside and back covers. This, of course, is Palouse, and my my point of showing you this photo is not to remind you how photogenic the Palouse is. It's just to suggest that this is what all of Eastern Washington would look like absent the Great Floods. We'd have a lot more Palouse hills, a lot more wheat, but what we wouldn't have would be all these incredible lakes like Rock Lake and Sprague Lake. And you can see these black dots on the Brett's map. These are all lakes carved out by the Great Floods, without which we wouldn't have the wildlife, the massive amounts of waterfowl and other animals like mule deer that rely on this, frankly, unique landscape on Earth. I like this photo. It's from an old, I shouldn't say old, from the mid 80s, a USGS paper on the Spokane aquifer. But this shows you why Brett's referred to the Great Floods as the Spokane flood, because Spokane was the nozzle for the Great Floods. Every time Lake Missoula would come through that ice dam, it would come roaring through Spokane. And it created the terrain of our city. A lot of people don't realize that. I mean, although, you know, if you drive around the South Hill, and notice that you are constantly running into basalt outcrops, something unusual happened there. But people often ask me when they find out that I've been writing and photographing the Scablands, where is it? How do I get there? And my response is just look out your window because you're in it. This is one of my favorite stories of the Scablands. This is the largest meteorite to land in North America. Weighs about 16 tons, I believe. It was the Native Americans had discovered it in the Willamette Valley, I don't know how many hundreds of years ago. But the whites, a couple pioneer farmers found it in 1902 and tried to realized it wasn't on their property and tried to remove it once they realized that it was a meteorite. The way they realized that was one of them hit it with a hammer and it rang like a bell, because it is like 95%, well, it's 90% iron and about 5% nickel. And my friend and co-writer, Jack and I haven't done books together, but Jack has done his own remarkable series of Northwest books, one of them which is called Ancient Places. So Jack has the story. Jack beat me to the story of the Willamette meteorite, but it's a great story. And one of the things that evolved in it is there's no meteor crater. Where the meteor is found, there's no crater. And the question is, well, why not? And the reason is that it turns out that this meteorite didn't fall in the Willamette Valley. It fell up in Canada and got entrained in the Purcell Ice Trench and became part of the dam that got shattered when as the Ice Age was ending. So one of the Missoula floods unloosed this meteorite, but it didn't unloose it. Obviously, in that form, it would not have been able to, it would have just sunk to the bottom. But it was entrained in ice. It had its own iceberg, as did many of the rocks entrained in the Purcell Trench. So throughout the Columbia Basin, there are a number of granitic and metamorphic rocks that simply don't belong on that terrain. They don't match the bedrock. And the way they got there is through flooding. They were literally rafted in on icebergs. The icebergs would find a slope, the waters would recede, the ice would melt, and it would drop the granite. In this case, it dropped the meteorite. That's how this thing got to the Willamette Valley. You have to picture this roaring down the Purcell Trench, coming right through downtown Spokane, heading down towards Balula Gap, taking the turn at the Gap, going all the way down the Columbia Gorge and coming to rest in the Willamette Valley. I just think as a single story, it just tells you everything you need to know about the power of the Ice Age floods. So my slideshow takes a more scenic turn. I'm going to be showing you, the rest of the slideshow is basically my photography of the Scablands. And this is picture one. This is a formation known as the Devil's Toenail, which is downstream of the Bowl and Pitcher in West Spokane. very much worth the hike to visit, but it also shows the amazing destructive, creative force of the great floods, because the Spokane River did not make the Spokane River Gorge. The Ice Age floods did. The river just followed along. And actually, the Spokane River before the great floods actually ran up through Hilliard and not through the river gorge that we're familiar with today. This is, I just sold this photo today to someone who attended an earlier presentation involving the slideshow. This is a piece, the blue, orange, tan rock in the middle is a 1.5 billion-year-old chunk of the Belt Basin that wound up in my swimming hole in the Spokane River. It's bigger than a football, and it's resting on an altar of Grand Ronde basalt. So it's not only an attractive photograph, it tells an Earth story with one image. This is a granitic boulder from that was deposited in the river from the Ice Age floods. This is another photo from my swimming hole. And this is above my swimming hole. This is out in Riverside State Park. It's an attractive picture with the larch turning in the fall. But in terms of the Earth story here, I'm up 200 or 300 feet where the camera is above the Spokane River. That wall behind the larch is up another, close to 200 feet. You have to imagine during the Ice Age floods that the water overflowed, not just where the larch are, but overflowed that whole ridge with such force that it left, it was headed towards Fairchild Air Force Base once it got over that ridge, and with such force that it left ripples on the landscape as it did so. And this is where it went. This is out in a Scabland track near Fish Trap, Washington, not that far from I-90 as it approaches the town of Sprague. Those are camas blooms around this chunk of granite. I'm sorry, excuse me, that's basalt covered with lichens. This is another photograph pretty much of the same area. What I wanted to show here was the shape of this hill. You remember I showed the picture of the Palouse? Well, this is the Palouse. This is Palouse terrain after it has been scraped and overwhelmed by the Lake Missoula floodwaters. You can see that the basalt, that it's taken the topsoil right down to the rock, to the bedrock, these little islands of basalt. But is also, there were, remarkably, it turns out that some of the Palouse hills were arrayed in such a way that they could survive the floods, but they were all profoundly reshaped. And you'll notice the shape of this is much more elongated than a typical Palouse hill. I call them Brett's Hills because what Brett's noticed, one of the things he noticed when he was out there with his students is that these hills all pointed in the same direction. The steepest part of their slopes pointed to Spokane, and these long tails pointed to Pasco. Basically, they were aligning themselves to the current of the floodwaters on a grand scale, not unlike what you would see if you were looking at a creek at the way the sand would be influenced by the current and creek water, just lining up with the direction of the flow. I just threw this picture in here because I like frosty Scabland. This is these are the pines south of Turnbull on a frosty day. Yeah, I mean, it just says winter and maybe hot coffee to me. This is obviously from this time of year. This is out in that remote section of Whitman County where Rock Creek flows. So this is not far from the ancient lava fence. This is only about 2 miles from where I collected the lava spatter. Well, Palouse Falls. Yeah, so there's a story in, well, there's a chapter. It is a story in the book called The Canyon Thief. And it just, Brett's looked at this and it didn't take him long to figure out what happened. The Palouse River actually used to run through Washtenaw Coulee, down through the town of Canal, and then down to Pasco, and entered the Columbia River near Pasco. Obviously, it doesn't do that today. It makes a steep jog to the to the left, to the east, and flows down a beautiful gorge, just a gorgeous gorge to the Snake River. And Bretz realized that it wasn't the river that made that gorge, but it was one of the things his critics hammered him on, is that the preposterous idea that somehow a great flood had made the gorge and not the river. But one of the vindication stories, one of his most ardent critics in the geological establishment actually finally came to visit Washington in the 1960s and took the bus ride. One of Bretz's friends had actually organized it, even though Bretz wasn't on the bus that day. And as the bus came down into the canyon, the geologist almost, I think, literally smacked his forehead and just proclaimed, "How could I have been so wrong?" I mean, he got it in a heartbeat, that there was no way this river could have created this massive gorge. So this is a photo called "Until the Next Flood," and it's atop a palisade in what Bretz termed the Drumheller Channels, which is basically between Moses Lake and Othello. It's part of what today is the Columbia National Wildlife Refuge. There's a big festival there every year to celebrate the return of the sandhill cranes that come into the wetlands there. But geologically, it is a spectacular place, and it's a spectacularly unvisited place. My first visit there, I walked the whole length of this, did not see another human being except for my hiking partner, and only found one piece of debris that was unnatural, and that was a blue bottle cap during the whole walk there, the whole day. That was the only thing. I mean, this place is remarkably unvisited, but it's well worth visiting. It's kind of tricky because the federal government controls access to give maximum room to migrating waterfowl, including the sandhill cranes. This is a photograph of Dry Coulee, which is part of that complex of coulees and canyons that are east of the Sun Lakes area, Dry Falls, if you know that area. This is from Potholes Coulee. This is a waterfall in the upper part of the North Ventricle. It's just a majestic shot of the water coming over the basalt pillars there. This photograph is called Below Judith Pool, which is the pond that is the source of the water here. This, of course, is Upper Grand Coulee. Out in the distance, if you see the road on the right, the road is pointing, as it goes toward the horizon, it's pointing directly at Steamboat Rock, which is a landmark in Upper Grand Coulee, but also the site of probably Eastern Washington's most popular campground. It's a huge campground. And you have to imagine during the Ice Age floods that water overflowed this entire scene. This is a former landscape. So what we're looking here is the former top of the surface of the land. All of this was gouged out by the great floods. You have to imagine that the floodwaters overflowed Steamboat Rock even by like 100, 150 feet. It's just incredible to try to picture that. This is one of the more picturesque palisades in the Scablands. This is in Moses Coulee, near the town of Palisades, about where, trying to remember the name of I think it's Douglas Creek that comes in there. But you can see just how dramatic that is. This is what spring looks like in the Scablands. I actually took this photo out. If you all know what the terrain around Sprague Lake looks like by July, and it's burlap. But as it is this year, when the Scabland gets enough rain, beautiful things happen. So this is, the white flower is yarrow, the yellow with the red pom-poms is blanket flower, and the pink flowers are actually wild geranium, otherwise known as sticky geranium. And it's just a beautiful spring bouquet. I imagine if we were out there today, this is what it would look like. I took this photo probably in, I think, May, three or 4 years ago. This is a form of balsam root called Carey's balsam root that comes into bloom after the arrowleaf balsam root, the yellow flowers that just go crazy on our landscape pretty much as soon as it feels like spring. There is still quite a bit of arrowleaf balsam root that's still in bloom this year, but the Carey's, I was just out photographing the new Carey's blossoms and the wild onion. This pink flower in here is wild onion, Douglas's onion. Yeah, well, I think it speaks for itself. I don't have to describe what you're seeing. It's just a beautiful floral display. And this again is out near Fish Trap. This is why I love mule deer. I was out in the Drumheller one morning, got up early, 4 o'clock, and drove out there just so I could get a sunrise shot. And I just had this sense as I was setting up to shoot, the camera was pointed, well, towards us. And I looked behind me and there was this herd of mule deer. I mean, it just shows just how curious and charismatic mule deer are. I mean, they really have good reason to fear any human out there, whether he's carrying a camera or a gun, but they are just inherently curious. They want to know what's going on in their terrain, and they're of course very protective if they feel threatened. They are a matriarchal society, and I think this picture illustrates that with the guys sort of looking off in the distance and the girls checking me out. This is the American kestrel, which is a fairly rare and hard to photograph bird. It's really difficult to get close to because like a lot of the other raptors, they have incredibly acute vision and are really wary of people encroaching on their territory. This one was just really interested in lunch and was distracted by prey, and that's why it got comfortably at perch, because it wasn't focusing on me, it was focusing on its next meal. Yeah, big moose. This is a moose from the Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge, munching on red twig dogwood. I think it was the day after Christmas a few years ago, a couple years ago. My son was with me when I took this photo. Although he was behind me, I try not to let my children get between me and a moose. My dad instincts. These are two of my favorite birds of the Scablands. You'll probably recognize the one in the background as the red wing blackbird. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I saw a yellow-headed blackbird out on I-90. I guess corn had fallen off a truck or something, and the birds had come up from ponds and were eating it off the shoulder of the road. And I was just stunned. I'd never seen a bird like that. But the best part is hearing them sing. If you think the red winged blackbirds are loud, these guys are much louder. They have an incredible wail and a chainsaw-like growl. And it makes me laugh because it just sounds so overbearing and bellowing, but it's also a beautiful bird too, as you can see. Okay, this guy, my son, Devin, and I have actually swum in Latah Creek with river otters. When I met this guy last winter, he was not in a swimming mood. At least he didn't want he didn't want me around. He was actually barking at me for part of the time I was taking his photo. Remarkably, he stayed and climbed up on the ice. There's an ice shelf between me and him, and he actually came up and checked me out. But basically, he was letting me know that he didn't want to swim with me that day. But look at that facial expression. I mean, it's just, it's, I don't know, gnarly to say the least. So this is another experience I've had on Lake Talk Creek. I try to make friends with herons, and some will let me, most won't. This is one that got used to me being around, so I photographed her last winter. But obviously, you don't just show up and get a photograph like this. I, had to have enough. I had to earn her trust enough to let me hang around for a half hour more. And so she was that comfortable with me, and eventually gave me this fantastic stretch. The name of this photograph is called Showtime. This is an American badger. Every time I see these photos, I'm reminded instantly of the encounters with the animals, because that's there's all kinds of things you can do technically with photography, but when you're doing nature photography, there's really no substitute to getting to know your subject, and frankly trying to develop a relationship of trust with that subject that will at least let you get within camera range to be able to get a photograph like this. I didn't stay very long after I was sure that I got the photo I wanted. This is out near Lamont, on actually an abandoned, I think it's the old Portland Spokane rail line that's now one of the rails to trails, where he had was denning inside one of the rock chambers along the old rail line. This is I don't know if there is one symbol of the Scabland. Maybe it's the Western Meadowlark, and I say that because Meadowlarks, like the yellow-headed blackbird, really not interested in coming into town. I mean, they're very sensitive to humans, and they will keep their distance. And a meadowlark, as much as any bird, will tell you when you're committing suburban sprawl, because they will leave, and you have to go out where people aren't in order to find them. But there's just nothing that is more uplifting to me to go out there in March or early April and hear meadowlarks again. Yeah, it's worth the gas, even at $5 a gallon. And this is my swimming companion from the Spokane River. I probably swim as much as anybody in the river, because my father was a swimmer and raised me to be a swimmer. And I am so tired. I used to be a competitive swimmer. I have no more interest in swimming in tile-lined pools anymore. My brain has had enough of those. So one of the great success stories of the Scablands, environmental success stories of the Scablands, is the recovery of the Spokane River. A river that was once an open sewer and one of the most polluted in the country, to the point where the State Department of Health warned people from having contact with it, is now a clean river that supports not just red band trout, but humanoid swimmers like myself. And I've swum in the river now for 15 years, and I would be in there today, except, as you can tell if you go by the river, it's just really crazy dangerous to be in the river right now. It's just incredibly high. But when it calms down a bit, I'll renew this relationship, I'm sure. These are migrating tundra swans out on a lake. I think this was shot in late February, when they were returning back to the north. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful scene. And these are Goldeneye Ducks that it just turns out that in winter, creeks like Layton and the Little Spokane are much more populated with these less common diving ducks, like the hooded merganser and the goldeneye. So it's a good time of year when it gets a little bit colder to go out and see these beautiful animals. This is obviously a red-tailed hawk, which is abundant in the Scablands, but also abundant. I was going to say, you know, when I was going up, I was going up to Rockwood yesterday to do this slideshow, and I'm about 3 blocks from where I was going up on 29th and Southeast, and I look up, and sure enough, there's a red-tailed hawk circling above. So yeah, they're around. So this is a young mule deer buck. I noticed him, and I noticed the herd, and I approached him and the herd gently, and then he noticed me and became curious in what I was doing there. He was actually walking toward me to check me out when I got this photo. One thing I'd done before then was to make contact with his mom, with the matron of the group, because there's just no better, that just is the way you have to connect with mule deer, is through the matron. If you're going to earn the trust of the herd, you've got to, I mean, they take their lead from the leader of the pack, which is usually the senior female. And so that's how this photo came about. And, you know, I'm grateful that I got the photo, but I'm also just deeply blessed to be able to have experiences like that, you know, to be able to interact with these wonderful animals. Sometimes maybe my mule deer karma is too good. I was 2 days ago, I was biking. I just finished doing a photo shoot down at my swimming hole, on my swimming lake now. And I was coming up, and I was coming back on Government Way, when all of a sudden these 2 mule deer does come right at me out of the rim rock. They had come down the rim rock and were about to cross the highway. You know, fortunately, I was dressed in my yellow stuff, and I started trying to slow traffic. Well, I first tried to block them from coming at me and crossing the road, because the traffic out there was just incredibly fast. People were going way over the 40-mile-an-hour, 50-mile-an-hour speed limit. And I was really scared, not so much for me, but for the drivers and the deer. And fortunately, oh gosh, yeah, I really did have a near miss situation, because I just happened to flag somebody's eye right before they encountered a deer, and he slammed on the brakes and scared the deer back. But eventually they crossed the road safely. Anyway, that was, I'm glad we have mule deer this close to Spokane. Some will come right into Brown's Edition here. I've seen mule deer in Brown's Edition in recent years. But of course, it also brings into play the hazards of them crossing motorways with high-speed traffic. Oh boy, I love this photo. This is called the Heart of Dry Coulee. It's actually on my business card. It was really, when I started doing photography, again, as part of this journey, this was one of the first photos I took that really gave me the satisfaction that I was doing my job well enough to take a photograph that could capture what this landscape is about in one image. So it was one of the first in my Scablands collections, and it just really, well, it's just very uplifting to me. These are black locust trees out in the Scablands, far, far away from the nearest town, which I believe in this area is Lamont. But Lamont is over the horizon. It just, you know, the austerity and the isolation. Obviously, those trees, the black locust trees were planted by a pioneer farmer long ago. But it just, for me, it just sort of captures the beautiful isolation of the scab. And this is just my business information for if you're interested in ordering prints from me. You can order any of the prints that are in the book if you get the book. You can also go to, I've actually just consolidated my digital images into a virtual gallery called the Beautiful Ones Gallery. So all the photos, most of which are on aluminum, that are in Moses Lake now at the Moses Lake Museum as part of the Beautiful Wounds exhibit there. And the ones that are now on display up at the Summit Gallery at Rockwood, they're all consolidated at Rhubarb Skies. There's an entry you'll see called the Beautiful Wounds, the gallery photos. So by all means, check them out. If you decide you want to buy one, let me know, and I'll work one up for you with my friends out on Monroe that do my prints. So I'm going to stop here and see if you got any questions. I probably covered things maybe in more detail than you would have liked, but if I left something out, be glad to try to fill it in.
I just have to say, I really was totally unfamiliar with the Scablands, but your photographs are phenomenal. They're really beautiful. And I'm curious what kind of camera you use.
You know, it's for me, it's the second generation Canon SLR. So, you know, it's a fairly affordable camera. I can't afford really expensive cameras. And I, you know, my body and my equipment, and hopefully not my companions, take a beating out there because of the terrain. And because you know, the camera's held up really well. For the underwater photography, I'll use an Olympus point and shoot camera that's designed to withstand shock. It's a camera that's specifically designed to take a beating and keep working. And it's also waterproof down to like 30 feet. So those are the ones I use for my underwater photography. So those photos that you see at the top of the screen there were taken with the Olympus. The ones below that, the birds and the sky and the feathers, were all taken with the Canon SLR.
I know that our local Audubon, unless you've already been there, I don't know, would love to have you give this presentation sometime.
You know, I'm really close with my friend Lindell Hagen, and she's trying to help me. Well, Lindell is one of the best birders in the state, and I actually, a year ago, connected with her to go do a specific visit to the Telford tract of the Scablands. It's kind of the middle tract that goes down, well, it goes into, see, I'm familiar with these places like the town of Harrington, you know where that is, the town of Odessa. It's between the big tract that created Rock Lake and Sprague Lake and Grand Coulee. There's one that runs down the middle, but it got destroyed by fire a couple of years ago. The Labor Day fire, just really so unfortunate. There was a sage grouse population that they've been working for years to rebuild in there, and it got completely wiped out by the fire. But it was coming back a year or so. Well, it was 1 year after the fire, and I asked her to go with me to help. I wanted her help in finding a specific bird that's in the book. It's called a sage thrasher, which she had told me was one of her favorite birds of the Scablands. And I said, hey, let's go look for it. So we went out there and we actually found it. And I was able to crawl around in the sage well enough to get a picture that's in the book. You'll see it in there. I can't remember what page it's on. So anyway, that's the long way of answering. Yeah, I'm very familiar with Audubon. I've done Christmas bird counts and I'm trying with one of the things I'd like to do is connect better with audiences on the West Side and share this story with them. So I'm working at that. Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you for your compliment. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, I appreciate your questions, Adela. If anyone else would like to unmute and ask questions or make comments, now would definitely be the time.
Tim, do you have comments on the Mima Mounds? M-I-M-A?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because when like a lot of the other people, I noticed when I started exploring the Scablands that terrain was, seemed very characteristic of the Scabland and connected to the Great Floods. And the extent to which it is still debated amongst geologists, because we also have Mima Mounds, or Mima Mounds, on the west side near Olympia, for example. There's actually a state park that's called the Mima Mound State Park over on the west side, which is nowhere near where the Great Floods were. So I wish I had a clear answer to that. I mean, I'll just say that there's something about Scabland terrain that invites the existence of Mima Mounds more than other places. And it's striking if you go out. For example, I sometimes will take friends and family to go see some of my favorite places. And one of them is this area that's, I mean, there are other areas like this, but there's a place east of Fish Trap along Scroggy Road, which can actually it's a dirt road you can pick up at the what used to be, I guess it's closed now, it's the Fish Trap Lake Resort. You know what I'm talking about? There's a small resort. Anyway, that goes east, and that area is it's just amazing. It's one, these beautiful green lush pimples after another in this rolling terrain. And it's also, a Scabland tract, and it's just beautiful. I mean, and the thing about Mima Mounds is that whatever the underlying cause is for them being there, the studies they've done botanically of what's on the Mima Mounds is incredible. The species are just overwhelming. I mean, there's just incredible biodiversity that they enable on those mounds. So that's basically what I know about them. And I love photographing them, especially in the spring.
Hello?
Go on.
Say something. Yeah, this effort going, and we really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I think it takes a lot of look and brain power how it all came to be. What happened in the past. I used to farm in Moses Lake, and we got some good farmland there. But I'm always wondering, after all that water came from Montana, came through here, that there's any topsoil left.
Yeah, and it's as you can go from Scabland to Palouse, abundant soil fairly quickly, just depending on where the Scabland tracts went and where they didn't go. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. There's one of my favorite roads to visit is right outside of Lamont. As you head south, the road out of Lamont, on one side, just by turning your head, you can look into classic Palouse farmland, beautiful rolling hills. You look to your right, and it's just rock. It's just completely different where the floodwaters went by. And so there's a fickle nature to that, but it's all because of just the gravitational pattern that Brett's noticed. We're dictating the flow of water at different heights.
But in Moses Lake and Otella, a lot of that soil is kind of built up with the volcanoes, I guess. The ash they blow up and, to build up the soil.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly volcanic material in there. We can see that from the Mount St. Helens ash. But the most recent theory about that soil, there's still a debate over it, but the thinking of the soil that we have in eastern Washington is that it actually is the residue of glaciers scraping rock, the crushing of the rock by the advance of the ice sheets, not just in the most recent ice age, but earlier ones.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have to add this, when I first did the Beautiful Wounds photography exhibit, I opened it in Moses Lake right the week before the museum was shut down because of the COVID. But the reception was extraordinary. There were 4 mayors, current and past mayors of Moses Lake there. Nick Zentner, the geologist from Central, was there. And one of the women that was there to help with the exhibit, I met her on the way in. She didn't realize who I was, and I didn't realize that she was a volunteer. And then the artistic director I was working with introduced me to her later in the evening, and she said, "Oh, we've met." And then she started crying. And I thought, what's wrong? And she didn't say anything. She just pointed at one of the photos and touched her heart. And then she said, "That's my home." By which she meant, she was just saying, this landscape that I grew up in has been ridiculed as a wasteland. It really can be beautiful. Thank you for doing your work to show the beauty of where I come from. And that's just like the best compliment I've ever been paid as a photographer. So, and that was there in Moses Lake. That was pretty cool.
Well, Tim, I want to thank you so much for making the time to be with us today and to give your presentation. It was really lovely, and some of those photos are just jaw-dropping. So thanks for doing
Thank you.
the work that you do. And thank you to everyone who attended today. It's wonderful to have a good send-off to this series of virtual programs, and hopefully we'll see some of you next month at the picnic at Manitou Park in July. But in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And again, thanks so much, Tim.
And thank you for your patience and giving up your lunch hour. Appreciate
All right.
it.
Take
Okay.
care and
Bye.
Bye.
be well,
Thank-
everyone.